and have a seat. Welcome to Village Church. If this is your first time here, my name's Steve. I'm one of the pastors here at Village Church, and as always, I'm thankful and grateful to see each and every one of you. If you have a Bible this morning, go ahead and open to Matthew chapter 26. We're going to be starting in verse 17 as we continue to make our way through the entire gospel according to Matthew. But in our journey through Matthew, we've moved into the time frame just before the crucifixion of Jesus. Last week, we saw the plot to arrest Jesus begin to take form with the religious leaders, gathering with the high priest Caiaphas to begin to form a strategy to arrest and kill Jesus. And we then saw Judas go to those same religious leaders to betray Jesus and commit to aiding them to find an opportunity to arrest Jesus when he was alone. This week, we're moving into the day before the crucifixion and the events surrounding the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples. Once again, we will see that every part of these events paints a picture of what is about to happen and reveals the sovereign authority of God over every one of these events, as everything that happens according to the design of God. And so as we look today at verses 17 through 29 of Matthew 26, we see Jesus instructing his disciples as to the preparation that he requires for them to share the Passover meal together the evening before his crucifixion. And it's during that meal that Jesus will reveal the direct connection between the Passover meal and his crucifixion. It's during this meal that Jesus also reveals to Judas that he knows of the betrayal that is about to happen in his life. And of course, he confronts Judas with that betrayal, but he also institutes what we see and what we continue to reflect on as the Lord's Supper as a means of worship until the second coming. And so I want to begin reading there in Matthew 26, starting in verse 17. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12, and as they were eating, he said, 'Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me.' And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him, one after another, 'Is it I, Lord?' He answered, 'He who has dipped his hand in this dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born.' Judas, who would betray him, answered, 'Is it I, Rabbi?' He said to him, 'You have said so.' Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.'" And so we see the series of events take place from just before the Passover meal to during the Passover meal to as Jesus kind of gives them this revelation that the Passover had always served as a testimony or even as a prophecy of what would happen through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But Jesus is very clear, number one this morning, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Passover. Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Passover. And so if you're unfamiliar with the Old Testament or unfamiliar with the history of the nation of Israel, understand that Passover was a celebration of God's redemption. Last week, Jesus noted that his death would occur actually during the Passover time frame. And in the nation of Israel, this is a reference to an annual reflection of God's redemption of his people Israel from their bondage to slavery in Egypt. God judged the sin of Egypt and Pharaoh's refusal to free Israel from their slavery after God had commanded it be done. And so in response to Pharaoh's refusal, God sent 10 plagues to the nation of Egypt. Some were less severe than others, but all of them were a judgment of God on the nation of Egypt that were unmistakable in the effect that they had on their lives. And the final plague would be the most severe. It was the death of all of the firstborn sons of the nation of Egypt at the hand of God's death angel. But God spared Israel through a sacrifice of a spotless lamb and a meal shared in reflection of God's salvation. And so I want to read to you the narrative from Exodus chapter 12. I'm going to start reading in verse 3, then skip down to verse 7. God says to the nation of Israel through Moses, "Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. Anything that remains until morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." So just pause right there, just so you know. If you don't have a staff with you today, you can still reflect on communion. The reason that God had that part indicated in there is because it was to be eaten in light of the fact that they were about to leave the nation of Egypt. It says, "Eat it with haste, because this is God's redemption. You will soon be leaving, so be prepared to depart." Verse 12, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you." And so the reason it's called the Passover is literal sense, is that when God saw the blood of the spotless lamb on their doorposts, the death angel would pass over their homes. "And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast." And so note that God tells Israel, this is the way in which I will redeem you. Redemption always involves sacrifice. To be redeemed means to have the price that you owe, or is that owed for you, paid by someone else. God would pay the price for Israel's freedom. And so sometimes when we read the stories of Israel, we think, oh, Israel deserved this. No, this is an act of mercy on God. God sought to redeem Israel, paying a price by which they did not deserve to be paid on their behalf, but God paid it. He transferred the debt that Israel owed to God onto the Passover lamb. And as that sacrifice was made according to the obedience that God had demanded them, God saw it as a picture of the payment that would be paid in the future by Jesus Christ. And so note that the lamb served as a sacrifice for who? For the firstborn sons of Israel. And so if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, I hope that in your head, you're kind of making some connections that God would pass over at the sight of the blood of the spotless lamb. This, of course, is an analogy of Jesus Christ. This is a type of Christ figure in the Old Testament. And the lamb served as a picture of what Christ would someday do to redeem all of the nations of the earth through faith in Jesus Christ. As the death of those firstborn sons served to pay the penalty that God demanded from Egypt, so the only begotten Son, the firstborn Son of God, would serve to pay the penalty for our sin. Verse 7 points out the name of Passover, and then talking about the Passover lamb passing over as provision has been made by God. So also Jesus serves to pay the penalty so that the debt that we owe to God will not incur his judgment, and he will pass over all those who trust in him. But note also, when you think about sacrifices made for sin, it might make no sense. Why does God demand an animal's life? Can the blood of an animal serve as some mystical, some supernatural, some magic formula to redeem people from sin? If that's the way that you look at animal sacrifice, then you're kind of not getting the picture of what happened in the gospel. It is only the sacrifice of Jesus that could pay the price for sin. Last week we made mention that during the Passover feast, in just a few hours, some 260,000 sacrificial lambs would be slaughtered in Jerusalem to serve as a sacrifice for the sins of the families of all Israel. And at memorial, they did this every single year. The blood was so great that it would flow down the streets of Jerusalem, down into the Kidron Valley, and the brook of the Kidron Valley would flow crimson red for a few days because it was so stained by the blood of the sacrificial lamb. And consider that 260,000 lambs being slaughtered, the scent of death was probably pervasive throughout Jerusalem. The blood being spattered all over Jerusalem must have been a horrific sight. Must have been a terrible few hours in Israel as this happened over and over and over and over. The blood staining so much so that the brook runs crimson red. And I don't know about you, but I'm not a huge fan of the sight of blood, especially if it's mine. That's supposed to be in there, not out here. All right? And so if the sight of blood doesn't bother you, I think you need to see a therapist because that's just some gross stuff. And so if you kind of get squeamish around medical stuff and you don't watch medical shows because they go a little gratuitous in their depiction of what's going on, you get a little squeamish. It's actually, I think it's fairly normal. I think that serves as a natural revelation to us that something is wrong. There's a reason that we respond to death the way that we do. There is a reason that we respond to the sight of life leaving the body, because that's the picture of blood, is that life is literally leaving the body. It's not supposed to happen that way, and that was the point of what was going on in Jerusalem. God wanted Israel, his people, to have a picture in their minds. This is the cost of your redemption. This is the cost of sin. This is how serious God takes sin. So often we take our sin so lightly, but year after year after year in Israel, God demanded thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of sacrifices that over the years added up to millions of sacrifices, because God says that is how horrified I am by your sin. Friends, when you take the sinful decisions that you make in your life, when you take the disobedience that you have to the commands of God in your life and you take it lightly, God demands that you see a picture of why you shouldn't take it lightly. And so God did not use the blood of these lambs to actually atone for their sin. It couldn't. How do I know that? Look at Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4. It says, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And he goes on and he gets even more thorough. He says, you think these sacrifices took away your sin? They couldn't. There's nothing magical going on with the blood of those bulls. That's why back in the 80s when they had the satanic panic and all the goth kids would run into the woods and sacrifice cats and try to summon up Beelzebub, nothing was happening. There's nothing magic about those incantations. There's nothing magic about the blood of an animal. Rather, what is supposed to happen is a revelation of how God is nauseated by your sin. If you hate the stench of death, that is how God feels about the stench of our rebellion against him. But the good news, if you go down to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10, he talks about how the blood of bulls and goats and lambs and all of this blood that's going on in the Levitical sacrificial system, he says none of that could ever fully atone for your sin. But then in verse 10 he says, by that will we have been sanctified through what? The offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And he says, every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices. He says over and over in redundancy. But then he knows, which can never take away sins. That system couldn't take away sins. It served rather as a symbol of your sin. But Hebrews 10:12, he says, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins. He sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. Verse 14, for by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who've been sanctified. See, friends, the entire picture and reflection of the Passover served to point forward to the one, Jesus Christ, whose sacrifice could pay the price for redemption from sin. He is the spotless lamb. He is the ultimate sacrifice. Jesus and Jesus alone is the one that could offer his life as an atonement forever for our sin. Not through continuous sacrifice in the temple. Rather, Jesus could do it once for all. How? Because he is God the Son. He is the one to whom the debt is owed. Therefore, he owes no debt for sin. And since he owes no debt for sin, he could be the perfect substitute. And that's exactly why he had determined that his crucifixion would take place during the time of Passover, because he fulfills the ultimate sacrifice. That's why we don't call it the Passover meal. The Passover meal is over. That's why when I see churches inviting rabbis to show them how to do the Passover, I say that's a terrible thing to do. It's been fulfilled. It's over. It's a meaningless ceremony now. We don't point backwards to the redemption from Egypt. We don't need to. We have a better redemption. We point backwards to the death of God the Son on the cross. We do not offer animal sacrifices anymore, because if we did, it would be blasphemy against God the Son. We reflect on the crucifixion because that is the only offering. Look in Hebrews 10:14. For by a single offering he has perfected. If it's perfect, do you think you can add to it? No, when you try to put your spin on it, do you know what you're doing? Ruining it. That's what you have to offer the gospel. You can ruin it. So why don't you just accept it as it is through Jesus Christ? Because he and he alone can perfect for all time those who have been sanctified. Jesus is the perfect. He is the ultimate. There's no more sacrifice needed. And so Jesus, at the perfect time in this text, sends his disciples to secure a room that he in his sovereignty has already secured for them. It says, find a man. Another gospel tells us that he was going to be carrying water in a vase, and that would have been a strange thing for them to see. And so they go to him, they get the room secured. Jesus gathers with them. And as they're eating, Matthew focuses specifically on the dialogue with Judas for the whole meal. Now, there's a whole meal shared, but Matthew focuses purposefully on really two things: on the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of Judas. And so number two this morning, I want you to understand that God is sovereign and you are responsible. God is sovereign and you are responsible. And so he goes in the text, and it says in verse 20, when it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. And as they were eating, Jesus drops a bomb on them. He says, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And right there in that sentence, truly I say to you, one of you betray me, you see the two most important aspects that you can apply to your life, I believe, where sanctification and theology are to be understood. First, you see the absolute sovereignty of God. Judas had already gone behind the back of Jesus and secretly, kind of quote unquote, betrayed him. But it's not a secret to God. There are no secrets to God. And so Jesus, in this moment, he unleashes on Judas, I know what you've done. And everything that you've done serves only to further my plan. This is the absolute sovereign control of God on everything. Further back in verse 18, we see that Jesus makes the statement. He says, my time is at hand. Now, in the original language, there's a few ways to refer to time, but the two most prevalent were kairos and chronos. Chronos serves as a general understanding of time. It's just like time exists. But Jesus doesn't say my chronos or my general time. I'm kind of feeling like the crucifixion's about to happen. I don't know, there's a different thing in the air this year. I think I need to die this year. Maybe it could work out. Jesus uses the term kairos, which is a reference to a specific occasion in time. It's a different word altogether. And Jesus uses that to say the event is going to happen. It's a specific occasion. He's pointing to the sovereignty of God's plan for his crucifixion. And so Jesus is fully aware that the events that are at hand and fully aware of what Judas has done. And Matthew focuses in intentionally on the betrayal of Judas during the Last Supper. Jesus, of course, orchestrating, planning everything about this supper so that they could be in private, so that he could teach his disciples. But he also has to put at the time, and he lets Judas know, now is going to be the time where you're going to betray me. The conversation with Judas points to both the foreknowledge and the foreordination of Jesus in this event. Now, generally speaking, Revelation 13:8 and Ephesians chapter 1 serve as kind of good pictures, biblically speaking, of specific texts where it talks about the fact that the foreordination of the gospel happened before God ever created the world. It uses the phrase, before the foundations of the earth, Jesus was the Lamb who was slain. Ephesians 1 talks about the fact that we've been blessed in the heavenly places before the foundations of the earth by the Son of God before the foundations of the earth. And so this was according to the foreknowledge and foreordination of the gospel. And so Acts 2:23, though, poses it differently. It kind of treats it as a real-time type of sovereignty rather than a general type of sovereignty over a general event. There's some specificity. It notes that all of this happened. Every event is what it means in the original language, according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. So he's pointing to the sovereignty of God. Not just this sovereignty that some people who don't understand how logic works and how language works, they'll say, oh, God foreknew what was going to happen. So he had a knowledge of how people would act according to their decisions, but he forms his will around how my decisions are going to flesh out. And so this is all happening sort of according to sovereignty, but God doesn't work in those choices for me to make those choices. Rather, he has a foreknowledge that just he knows what I'm going to do before I do it. And that's just stupid. That's not how it works at all. God foreknows everything because God foreordains everything. The preacher Charles Spurgeon once said many years ago that in the morning when you see the sunlight coming into a window and you see the dust mites floating, Charles Spurgeon said, there is not a dust mite that does not hold its position according to the control of our sovereign God. There is never anything that has ever happened in this world in all of history that God has not been in control of. There's nothing that you can point to say whether it is the most righteous thing, obviously, or whether it is the most wicked event that you've ever thought of, obviously. Both of them happened according to the sovereign control of God. How do I know that? Because the gospel of Jesus Christ and the crucifixion is the most wicked event that has ever happened, the murder of God the Son. And Acts 2:23 says, every aspect of that event happened according to the foreordination, the definite plan of God. And so, friends, understand that Jesus does not walk into this saying, well, I wonder how this is going to work out. Well, I wonder what the conclusion of this story is going to be. That's why God has never looked at your life. And anything that's ever happened, no matter how great it was or how terrible and how much regret you have to where you say, I wish that had not happened, God has never looked at you and said, whoo, boy, wish I could help, but didn't see that one coming. You've never made a decision so regrettable that God said, well, you just threw me a curveball. I don't know how I'm going to work this one to my glory. No, that's impossible. That's not the way the world works. If that was the way that everything works, he would be no God at all. He would be nothing more than Oz behind the curtain. But rather, our God is absolutely sovereign to everything that ever happens. And so Judas's betrayal did not catch God off guard. His sovereignty was the same as it was in Genesis 50, verse 20, when Joseph looks to his brothers and he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. But note the end of Acts 2:23. He says, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. That's the second half of the equation. Not only is God absolutely sovereign, but man is absolutely responsible for every decision that he makes. God's sovereignty removes zero of your responsibility. Peter, speaking in Acts 2, he looks to the crowd and he says, you did it. You made the choice to do it. You are responsible for it. When he says the hands of lawless men, he's looking at the choice that they made and he's saying, you made a wicked choice and you will be held accountable to it if you don't turn to Christ in repentance. And so Jesus looks to Judas. He continues, he says, one of you will betray me. And I love the way that all the other disciples respond. They're sorrowful. The text is specific. It says that the other 11 had a great sorrow about them, and they're terrified that they're going to be the ones that do it. And I love the perspective of the disciples because they're usually so stupid. But at this point, they've learned enough about Jesus to where they know he is God, he is sovereign. If he says I'm going to do it, I'm in trouble. Because even if I don't want to do it, he said I'm going to do it, so I know I'm going to do it. He's sovereign. But then he continues and he says it's going to be the one who dips the morsel in his hand in the dish. And he makes an amazing statement of condemnation. He says, woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had never been born. Judas, who would betray him. And the reason I say the first statement was the other 11, because it's at this point where he says he got a reaction out of Judas. Because I think he scared him a little. Because Judas had already done it. And Jesus lays a woe, which if you were here throughout the rest of the book of Matthew, you know that woe means you are damned. It means you're condemned where you stand. He says, woe to the one who did it, because it would have been better if you'd never been born. And then Judas responds, not sorrowfully. The text doesn't say he was sorrowful. He just simply says, is it I, Rabbi? Am I the one? Knowing full well he was the one, because he'd already done it. And Jesus says, what does Jesus say? You've said so. In all of that, we see God's sovereignty on display right in front of Judas, but Jesus does not remove his guilt. Jesus says, you have said so. In other words, this one's on you. Friends, so many times, so many of you walk through your life thinking your decisions don't matter. You think you can waste a year or two. You think that you can make irresponsible decisions. You think that you can make decisions of disobedience where God's word is concerned, and that you don't have to bear the responsibility. You don't have to bear the consequences, and it's not going to hurt anyone around me. I'm just making some immature decisions at this point in my life because I'm an immature person. But friends, be confronted with the reality. Grow up. When my kids were young, I learned a great analogy where sin is concerned. And sometimes when they wouldn't inform us of what had happened in their diaper, I would just say, well, you're the one that's got to sit in it. I think you know what it is. Could rhyme it, but I won't. Ugh. But it's sometimes in life, people will make bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. You'll lay sin upon sin upon sin. And then you look at the world and say, why don't you trust me? Well, duh. Because everybody sees it. Just like the stench of the dead lambs in Jerusalem. Everyone smells the irresponsibility all over you. And yet you want everyone else to be held accountable to letting you continue in walking in damnation, walking in sin, walking in disobedience, and everybody's supposed to be okay with it. And then you will even be so audacious as to walk a line of blasphemy and say, well, isn't God sovereign? So if God is sovereign, it'll all work out anyway. What did that get Judas? It'd be better if you were never born, buddy, what you're going to face. Because you will face absolute condemnation. It's like that one friend everybody has who does nothing but go in debt for 30 years and then says, I don't know why my credit score's so low. I don't know why my cars are being repossessed. And then you're the guy that's been responsible and you say, well, I do. And at that point, just tell them they're not your friend anyway. They're an idiot. But friends, your decisions are going to have consequences in this world. Every one of them. Stop believing the lie that there are inconsequential decisions in your life. Every single decision that you will ever make matters in the long run. Everything. So take life seriously. I say grow up because it is so immature to think otherwise. You've not been confronted with the way the world works. And you certainly have a false picture of how God works in your mind. Yes, God sovereignly planned the gospel. But starting in Matthew 26:20, we see Jesus confronting Judas with the ramifications of the decision that he freely made. What Judas meant for evil, yes, God meant for good. God sovereignly planned the gospel. And in his sinfulness, Judas rejected faith in Christ and chose to betray Jesus. That is the accountability for sin. Every single one of us have to deal with the reality of that in our lives. You are responsible for the decisions to make, and learn something from Judas. To reject Jesus is to invite damnation into your life. Now, friends, there is, of course, a mystery to the sovereign hand of God. I am finite, he is infinite. But the fallout of sinful choices, well, that's right in front of your face. That's not that mysterious. You see that in people's lives all the time. Judas chose the path of sin. He chose evil over Christ. It is often said about culture that it's Christ or chaos. But that is true of personal choices as well. In John 13, starting in verse 26, the Apostle John points to the spiritual reality of what was going on in Judas's life in that moment. His record says, Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, it says, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to go do it quickly." That's a fascinating passage. Satan, I understand his part. He could think of nothing more that would make him happy than to be a part of betraying God the Son. Jesus, the text has already told us, had the glory of the Father. And Satan, of course, hated Jesus for that. In a very real sense, practically, I believe that every sinful decision that you make carries real spiritual consequences in your life. Note that in John 13, Jesus looks to Judas after Satan has entered him. And he says, to Judas, what you are going to do quickly. That is a symbol to us that Satan didn't have total control over him, but was using Judas still. Friends, you need to understand that when you give in to temptation, even as an unbeliever, there are spiritual consequences to your sin. That is the reality that you're going to have to deal with. That every moment of disobedience gives Satan more and more and more influence in your life. The harder and harder it's ever going to be to repent. But friend, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, do not discount the spiritual ramifications that sinful decisions have on your life. The more you choose the world over Christ, the more you choose disobedience over obedience, that serves more and more to give Satan more and more influence in your life to further and further reveal you were never a believer to begin with. You need to think, to the other 11 disciples, Judas had carried every mark of being a faithful disciple, even though he wasn't, for 3 years. But at this moment, the ramifications of all of his sin come to be where Jesus says Satan can have complete control over you. Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 26, points to the cosmic consequences of rejecting Christ. These are not just real life consequences of irresponsible decisions. There are cosmic consequences. Verse 26, for if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Now think about this. This is especially true of Judas' situation. Judas knew the truth. I mean, there's not really many better preachers than the Son of God. Judas had sat under his discipleship for 3 years at this point. This is a testimony of his life. Judas rejected Christ. He made that decision. He would be repaid for his sin in the hands of the living God. Friend, when you reject faith in Jesus and run into a life apart from Christ, this is the choice you are making. And understand, you are hearing the gospel even today. There are cosmic consequences into the hands of a living God. And instead of being joyful about it, the text tells us you should be very afraid. But then Jesus gives us this ultimate revelation of the Lord's Supper. And I'm thankful that he kind of goes into this direction so that we will not just be left with condemnation. Rather, he gives us the hope of new life. Before we got into part 6 of the Matthew series, I did a 10-week series over the summer on the Church of Jesus Christ. And the final sermon of that series, I talked in depth about the Lord's Supper. So if you want a larger treatment of the Lord's Supper, I would say go listen to our podcast where my sermons are on those issues. But number 3 this morning, understand that the Lord's Supper gives thanks for the past, forms communion in the present, and builds faith for the future. It's a longer phrase than I normally use. It gives thanks for the past, forms communion in the present, and builds faith for the future. Jesus wants us to reflect with gratitude. Look at what happens starting in verse 26. It says, now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, take, eat. This is my body. Now he's drawing the meaning of Passover and saying, this was never about an animal. This was pointing to me. He says, take, eat, this is my body. Judas is left. Now he's with the other 11, and he's giving his followers the meal and explaining to them for the first time in history, this is what it's about. It's about what I'm about to do on the cross for you. And said at the beginning that it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And there's a reason that we use unleavened bread. Originally, for the nation of Israel, it represented the fact that God had taken evil out from among them through the plagues. And so removing the leavening element is a picture of God removing the sin from them and placing it as a substitute on the scapegoat or the lamb. But Jesus is saying, now you eat of the unleavened bread. That's why we use unleavened, because I have taken the evil out of you. Because I have separated you from sin. And he continues, and he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus is telling us to be thankful for what he has done, to reflect. He had already prayed and given thanks for the meal. And the word used for giving thanks is the word Eucharisteo, which is what many translate now, and they call it the Eucharist when they reflect on communion. It's a word that simply means thankfulness. And so we give thanks for what has already happened in the past. It's an opportunity for us to gather and not simply reflect on what Jesus did, to say, yes, this happened, but to reflect on Jesus, on what Jesus did, and said, yes, that's what happened. I'm so thankful it did. Because you didn't pay the price for your own sin. And you certainly didn't deserve for Jesus to pay the price for your own sin, but he did it anyway. Aren't you thankful? Jesus says, eat and drink and reflect in gratitude, but it's further than the past. It also has ramifications for the present. He wants us to proclaim participation in his mission right now. In 1 Corinthians 10:16, when the Apostle Paul is speaking about the Lord's Supper, he uses the term participation. It says, the cup of the blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? That same word that's used for participation can be translated as communion. That's why some people call it communion. But he says you're participating. You're living in this sinful world, but you presently do not have the weight of your sin on your shoulders. It's been removed. You presently have reconciliation with God. Are you living in relationship with him? You presently have a commission from God to proclaim the good news of the gospel to all that will hear and to make disciples of all who believe. Are you participating? Are you in communion with God right now? Because I will tell you, my sin has been paid for. The atonement has been fully applied right now. But because of what happened in the past and because of my present participation, Jesus also wants us to walk into the future with hope. I love what he says in verse 29. He says, I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day, when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Jesus looks forward. He doesn't say, man, I really hope that this gospel thing works out so that we can be reunited. Jesus doesn't say, this might work. No, Jesus says, I will not drink again until that day. Not if, but when. It's going to happen. The future is secure. The past and the present are why I stand with hope about the future. Jesus declares it as a promise. It's going to happen. Friends, Christians should be the most hopeful and most vigilant in living for the kingdom of heaven because we know the gospel will triumph. It's not if, it's when. So when we reflect on the Lord's Supper as followers of Jesus, we do it as those that fully believe that all of the promises of God are yes in Jesus. Why? Because he died, but then he rose again. Friends, the amazing fact of the gospel is that even if I die, I will rise again into the kingdom of heaven forever. Do you have that hope? A few application points this morning. Jesus has offered the final and only sacrifice needed for sin. There's never going to be another one. There's never going to need to be another one. Jesus has once for all satisfied the debt of my sin. God's sovereignty, secondly, is a guarantee of his trustworthiness. Sovereignty provokes a lot of questions, but it should more so provoke a lot of hope and trust. Because if he wasn't in control, how could I trust him? But since he is in control, the only option I have is to trust him. Thirdly, you are absolutely responsible for your decisions. You are absolutely responsible. That's why God has given us his word. Because he wants us to walk into this life knowing what we should choose, knowing what we should do. You are responsible. Fourthly, if you reject Jesus, you will be condemned. If you reject Jesus, you will be condemned. There is no other path. But finally, the Lord's Supper then is a complete picture of the Christian life. Past, present, future. And that's why it's vital.